Hey there! Balance is one of the most important things in a game. It can make or break the experience completely. But how can we achieve balance in our games, and how can we tip the scales in favor or against the player in order to make the game more fun? Now, before we begin, I'd just like to preface this by saying that I've mostly worked on single-player games, with the exception of some local multiplayer games, so this video is mostly going to focus on them, so single-player games. Balance in multiplayer games, especially online multiplayer games, is a whole nother beast, which is a field that I am not at all experienced in. In my opinion, the most important thing that game developers need to understand about balance is the following. Balance does not mean that every weapon or item or thing is equally as good as the other. It means that everything has a distinct purpose. This means that a certain item can be very powerful in a certain situation while being completely useless in another. This means that, when balancing a game, there is more to it than just changing the thing that feels under or overpowered. For example, in my 2D medieval platformer, Weight of Armor, the player unlocks 3 different knights throughout their journey. Each knight has a distinct purpose. Harold the Huskarl damages enemies around him. Ron the Rascal charges and damages all enemies in a given line. And finally, Mervyn the Medic heals the player back up to full health. Because healing is useful basically everywhere, and the other knights are quite situational in comparison, I did a couple of different things. First, I made Mervyn the last knight the player unlocks, so they only have access to him in the last section of the game. Secondly, I designed levels that are meant to be completed using Harold or Ron. For example, because Harold drops in from the top of the level, in some levels I placed enemies above the player that can only be damaged and killed with Harold. I also designed levels which are pretty linear, meaning that Ron can damage all of the enemies, making the level much easier. Now, this next point might seem strange, however, you can get away with making something overpowered or underpowered. If you decide to make an OP weapon, for example, it can actually be really fun for the player. However, you should limit the player's access to that weapon, since if it's always available, the player will always choose that instead of other options, making the game stale. Similarly, you can make the player feel underpowered in certain sections of the game, especially for story purposes, but make sure that this state does not last for a long time and that the player feels a sense of progression. In conclusion, while balance might not seem as important in single-player games as it is in multiplayer games, it still has an important role in making the experience fun. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon. It helps a ton. Goodbye and take care.